Chapter 3 Time Hogs. Jason was his name, Jason Russell. Born somewhere in Southwest America in 1975. His parents were trying to escape pressures of one sort or another in their hometown and traveled down to Mexico while their son was but a few months old. They were performers of some kind, probably skilled in many arts, and were able to adapt their performance to what was wanted and needed in the towns they went through as they moved south. Before Jason was 2, his parents must have tired of each other because they headed north again and separated when they reached the border. His father went to Dallas, mother and child went to California, where they spent the next 4 years. She turned her abilities to acting and made a good living. They then ascended to Washington State and held residence for 3.5 years. She tired of acting and decided to study law. Then they moved to Dallas for 2.5 years. Dad had since moved to Washington State. That's what happens when you lose touch. Mom worked as a paralegal. Then to Chicago, where she was hired at a corporate law firm for another 2.5 years. Only 2 of which Jason was there for. On his 12th birthday, he set out on a 6-month journey back to Dallas, and then Washington, and then Oregon to find his dad. Jason dragged his father back to Chicago, where his mother was worried but still working, and holding a copy of divorce papers in her back pocket. His father signed them, and Jason managed to pull him into court to demand equal custody. He argued that it wasn't the amount of money a parent could give, it was the love and understanding that was important, and how she may provide a higher standard of living, but can that really make up for the father's influence? The judge ruled that for the 2 months off of the school year, the child would spend with his father in Oregon, and for the 10 months of the year spent in school, he would reside with his mother in Chicago. Another ruling was that there be no financial support to or from either side. As they left the courtroom, his mother remarked, "That was an impressive speech you made in there." "Thanks," Jason replied. His life continued in this fashion until his mother was moved up in her law firm and east to New York City. Jason was 15 and had displayed many talents, both creative and learned, by that age. When in his late teens, when his companions had grown a little bolder and were able to tell him what they truly thought of him, he remembered hearing that he seemed to be in such control of his abilities that he appeared bored or even put off by his surroundings. He was arrogant, but had the abilities to back it up. He could anger a whole room of people just to get their attention focused on him, and then suddenly switch to entertaining them to the point of laughter and applause. He was very much in control of his abilities. He had a very strong will. I am beginning to understand about will. It seems to be the last line of defense when it comes to justifying human existence. I am cynical for saying that, but what can one expect after having been taken advantage of? He has left traces of his memory in me, doing so to free up space in him to take various historical facts from the year 2000 on. I am able to recall these events in hopes of gaining an insight as to how I can stop him. I remember all the times he saved up money by working weekends and talking his mom into letting him go out to Oregon during spring break. It wasn't so much the affection for his father that he sought, but the freedoms that affection brought. So he bounced back and forth from sea to shining sea. Upon graduating from high school, he decided the life of a musician was for him. and he set about putting all his time and energy into that art. He held a job at a Midtown West Side clothing shop where he counted out and delivered buttons to other garment companies. It was a menial task that took very little energy and thought, which allowed him to call music his true profession, although he made more money as the button counter. Such were the times in mankind's history. From the 1200s to the mid-2900s, humankind held a natural obsession with clothing that shaped the faces of societies. It was, of course, the geographical location that dictated the type of garment. Then the style was set by the mood of the human wearing the clothes. 1,700 years of fashion led humanity to the brink of disaster until the awakening of the soul in the late 2800s. Before the year 3000, humanity had harnessed its inner abilities, and geographical location no longer was a factor in the garment type. Prior to the awakening, menial jobs were common, so Jason held one. The memory he left in me ends there. I have his perspective now. I have discovered a way to create a form of energy similar to light. It is a variation of beams and a sonic wave. I transverse time to see through the eyes of the body that I have created for that joker. I can hear what he thinks, although I have no bearing in his thoughts. Yet he knows I'm watching him. He stands on a street corner just beyond the reach of the lamp's light. He holds the crystal in his right hand. He understands where he is, why he is holding this object. He looks at his clothes, black jeans, black shirt, long black leather jacket, black leather boots. He would not be able to see himself if not for the fading glow of the crystallic stone. The light inside wavers, then dims. The stone solidifies into crystallite. He places it in his right pocket and starts thinking. Being in this time brings memories back to him. This was after Jerry had given him the keys to the studio. Just months ago, he had gone into the studio for the first time after the wake for Jerry. It happened to be that Carla was there that day. She knocked on the door and told Jason a secret she had been dying to tell someone. She'd gone to the studio the night Jerry sold the prototype to the stranger. She followed the guy to a Park Avenue residence and noted his apartment. After the plane crash that killed Jerry, she became suspicious and did some checking with the building owner. She learned that a whole floor was owned by a company called Biosyn, based in Thailand. The man she had followed was named Edmund Lewis. He worked for the company by putting data into machines and sending it via phone line to the main office when requested. Such a computerized network could be considered my ancestor to a certain degree. She also learned that he would be leaving in 3 months for a 6-week vacation. She pondered this and thanked the gray-haired gentleman and set out to home. Upon reaching her destination, she told her sister about this. They both played on each other's grief and anger over their friend's death and created a plan to find justice. Carla began calling the building owner to find out what exact day he would be leaving. The owner didn't give out such information, but her persistence wore him down, and he eventually told her after she spent 3 weeks calling him every day. Lucy, meanwhile, was going to school to be a journalist and turned her newly acquired research abilities to seeing what was up with Biosyn. The company mostly moved information back and forth between its 127 offices around the globe. Experiments were conducted in many fields of science ranging from genetic engineering to molecular construction. That was about all she could find, as there was very little cause for press coverage for the world's greatest society of scientists, except for an odd story in the New York Daily News a few years back that claimed a Biosyn employee was discovered to be an extraordinary age while he received medical care. The story was dead within a week, as the man escaped from the hospital and disappeared without leaving a trace. The reporter tried to cut through the red tape that secured the headquarters' privacy in Thailand, speculating that the man was actually the president of the company. The long-distance calls were becoming too expensive, and so the reporter abandoned the story along with his dreams of becoming a columnist. The twins had the plan, but they needed someone to help them execute it. That's why Carla went to Jason. The Joker stands on the street corner, remembering this time in his first life. He suddenly recognizes the street corner he's on. He is 2 blocks from the twins' apartment. He begins to walk. He remembers this night. This was the night that the plan was to go into action. He got stuck at work and was greeted by, "You're late," when he finally reached the apartment. Now he walks casually over the paved ground and tries to recall parts of my memory that he has infused into his new body. His stride turns into a strut as he begins to remember historical facts from the 1900s through the early 3300s. He has stolen knowledge for which he shall pay. I must continue to generate energy. He smiles, knowing that he has beat me back slightly, chased me out of his head only for a moment. He continues to walk, enjoying the sounds and sights of the city, the touch of the breeze, the taste of the air. He is attempting to intoxicate me with sensations and human experience. He has reached the door and rings the bell twice. The security door buzzes back and he enters the building. Carla opens the door. "You're early," she says, closing the door behind her. "Do you have the phone?" he asks. She holds up a cellular phone and places it in her bag, telling him that everything is set. That Joker begins to wonder, as he walks, about what will happen when Jason shows up at the apartment in 20 minutes. He has already concluded that his new body must look exactly like his original, so when Jason does show up late, it should be more than confusing to Lucy, who stays behind. He wonders what will happen, but can come to no conclusion. He is doing this on purpose, to give me a problem to solve, to try to distract me from his actions. I will learn from him to stop him. He has posed a problem to me that I have no need to solve. I also have no want to solve it, although I am more than capable of doing so. I will decide not to solve it for him. Done. This has upset him, and he is showing so through a form of physical anxiety. He stops Carla in mid-sentence by walking into a store on 56th and Lexington. She follows him in. He walks down one of the tiny aisles and picks up a roll of aluminum foil. "What are you doing?" Carla asks him. "We'll need this later," he replies. "What for?" "You'll understand soon enough," he tells her. He walks to the counter to purchase it and realizes that he forgot to have me synthesize money for him. He looks to Carla and asks her to spot him $5. She shrugs and sighs and reaches into her purse. She waits outside as he pockets the change. The crystallet starts vibrating in his coat pocket. The cashier regards him oddly. He switches the foil to his left hand and hurries out of the store. The crystal quiets down, and he and Carla continue walking. He remembers the plan. He also remembers how it originally transpired, how it was later considered a failure. He knows how he will change the plan. He knows what variation he will perform to ensure success. He hides those thoughts from me by embracing his sexual drives. He walks and allows himself to enjoy his natural physical attraction to Carla. This puzzles me. The notions of sexuality and sexual drives. Being neither male nor female, I cannot fully comprehend the neural patterns he is conveying to me. They reach the residence and stand outside the building. Carla takes a deep breath, and I find his eyes focused on her chest. They walk into the building and onto the lobby desk, where she requests of the guard that Edmund Lewis on the 16th floor be summoned. The guard picks up the phone as Joker's eyes stare at Carla's legs. Within minutes, a man steps out of the elevator and walks to the desk. That Joker studies the man and can see that most of his strength and weight are in his upper body. Edmund's light brown hair curls up from his scalp. His arms don't swing as he walks. "What's this all about? I'm about to leave for vacation," Edmund says. "Edmund Lewis," Carla starts. Ed nods. "I would like you to answer a few questions about your connection to Jerry Chow." "Don't know the man," he replies. "You purchased a certain element from him for the sum of $80,000 not more than 4 months ago," she returns. Edmund turns to the guard behind the desk and asks him to step outside for a few moments. The burly man nods and rises, scratching his nose as he walks out the door. Edmund turns back to Carla and Joker. "I don't know who you two are, but you're swimming into deep waters. If you must know, I work for the company that created the prototype. We bought back what was stolen from us. I think we've been more than courteous," Ed says. "We have reason to believe that you were responsible for the plane crash at JFK 3 months ago," Carla states. "What?" Ed laughs. "Where have you been? Every paper has reported that it was mechanical failure that destroyed that plane. I know that Jerry Chow was on that plane because you requested that he get out of town, and that you had purchased the prototype from him in hopes of keeping him quiet about Biosyn's contact with him," she persists. "What are you getting at?" Ed asks. "This." Carla pulls the cellular phone from her bag. "My twin sister is waiting for me to call her. When I do, she is going to fax an article about Biosyn's role in the worst plane crash in history to every news bureau in New York. The news will spread worldwide within days and cause major damage to your company unless I get some answers." A silence hangs in the air. In the original history at this point, Ed grabbed the phone out of her hand and broke it in two. Dropping the pieces to the floor, he commented that Biosyn would use teams of researchers to prove her claim false. He then turned and walked away. This time, though, that Joker is there. He steps forward between Carla and Ed, holding out the roll of aluminum foil. Both Carla and Ed are perplexed by this turn of events and forget their momentary battle to watch as that Joker places the crystalline on the desk. He then cuts off a sheet of the foil and places it on top of the crystal. The foil buckles, then bends, then is dissolved into the crystal. An amusing trick. "How is it done?" Ed asks. Carla stares wide-eyed. "It's not a trick. This stone is an organically grown mineral that can conduct any energy current. It is actually a computer of sorts with knowledge your company can only dream of. Ed squints at him. Not interested, he grumbles as he turns to walk away. Hey! Carla calls back his attention. What about my questions? Ask whatever you'd like, but I can't guarantee an answer, Ed says. Carla starts after him. Now wait a minute. Ed turns around to face her and yells, causing her to jump. I don't wish to be bothered with speculations of paranoia right before my vacation, miss. I'm sorry your friend died, and I'm sorry that I gave him the means of getting on that plane, but there's nothing that can be done now. Carla's lips start to quiver, and it is clear she was about to start crying. That will be enough, Edmund, says the man walking from the elevator. He is tall and thin and wears a dark blue suit. To his right is a man wearing the same clothes and about the same height and build, but he is clearly an Asian man, as the one who spoke looks European. They stride into the lobby and Ed backs off. The Asian man hands a packed bag to him as the other approaches Carla. I apologize for his temper, but Ed here has earned himself a vacation. He reaches down and lifts her hand. My name is Joachim, and I'm very pleased to meet you. He kisses her hand. Quickly, he turns to that joker who is still standing by the desk. An organic computer, you say? Joachim picks up the crystallit. He turns to the Asian man. What do you think could come of this, Dave? Dave shrugs, and Joachim turns back to Carla. I'd like for you to answer a few questions concerning, she begins. Yes, I know. The plane crash, the prototype. I was listening to every word you said, and since my operations are hidden from the American press, you'd have no reason to believe what I say. I guess I'll have to break my own privacy code, if you'll come with us. Where? She asks. To Biosyn's headquarters. You're both invited. Do you have the authority to do that? She inquires. My dear, I just traveled halfway around the world to retrieve this hunk of metal and ensure that I do not lose it again. I have the authority. I'm the president. Calculation is the focal point of any plan. That joker has done it. He has altered history. The plan is a success. Joachim is intrigued by the crystallit and Carla, and will bring the two of them to Thailand. That is at least a 12-hour flight. I'm going to shut down for that amount of time and try running my new energy generation program. I have adapted it to create an exponential energy split that should help to speed up the process. It will take me some time to reconfigure components to activate the program, shutting down and generating energy for the next 12 hours. My last memory is of that joker standing at the heliport as the helicopter lands to take them to Joachim's private jet at LaGuardia Airport. Evidently, Joker fed the entire aluminum roll to the crystallit in an attempt to reactivate it. The stone glowed slightly, but it couldn't self-generate nearly enough energy to activate itself from the foil. Ed had taken hold of it for the rest of the flight to ponder ways to get inside. Joker told Dave about the molecular construction method encoded in the crystal. After some time, they started to play a game with dice. Acey-deucey was Dave's name for the game, and they each rolled a die trying to come up with a 1 or 2. After 6 or 7 rolls, that joker started calling the numbers before they were thrown. He got 12 in a row right. Dave got up and went to get a drink. Joachim spent most of the flight with Carla, convincing her that the plane crash that took away her friend was coincidental. He eventually talked her into calling her sister. Before Lucy could ask where she was calling from, Carla hung up and drank Joachim's glass of wine. Joker found the plane ride very boring and managed to get a few hours of sleep on the way. After landing, they drove for 3 hours, 4 with traffic, to the southern peninsula of Thailand. 3 miles south of Takupa, they drove onto the deck of a waiting ferry, owned privately by Joachim. The boat pushed across the Strait of Malacca to the tiny port town of Idi on the island of Sumatra. They cut east and continued south through the grasslands until they neared the equator. 2 miles from the equator, Joachim informed everyone that they had a 2-mile hike through the jungle to reach the headquarters. They started walking. The heat was almost unbearable, but Dave carried a large sealed backpack that held about 45 gallons of water for everyone to drink. Ed offered to carry it for a while. David declined and continued walking. I re-entered the scenario at this point, and I am happy to report that the program is a success. I have generated enough power to replenish my reserves and will soon be able to perform another burst in hopes of rectifying the last one. I must be aware of my chances when they occur. They now walk in the humid sunset temperatures across another patch of grassland. There is a hill about 200 feet high and 100 feet away that they are walking towards. Carla asks if the building is much further beyond the hill and is met with no answer. They start up the hill a few yards and then work their way around at about a 30-degree angle. The breeze suddenly picks up. There is the roar of water. Joker looks up and, through his eyes, I see it. At the base of the mountain is a large crater in the ground that collects water from the waterfall that turns the turbines embedded in the side of the hill. The water is then pumped back up to the top to complete the man-made circle. A tract of land 500 feet wide is cleared away and stretches at least a half a mile away from the mountain. That whole valley is covered with solar cells that are collecting the last of the day's light. In between the 2 power plants is the 1-story, 500-square-foot headquarter building of Biocen. My God, Carla says. Joachim turns to her. Used to have the main office in Bangkok. Had to get out of there. Couldn't stand the city. I need the simplicity of nature. What's with the work crew? Joker asks, calling attention to the 10 poles surrounding the building and the people and cranes moving what look to be giant fan blades. Joachim looks out at the work crew. We're installing a new form of electricity generators. Set up in this pattern, I can power 1 fan from the reserves and turn the turbines of the other 9 to generate more power than I use. It's a large and complicated system, but with these generators and the areas surrounding that we have prepared for farming, we have a self-sustaining community. Joachim looks with pride at his creation. Joker enjoys the view as well. You truly are ahead of your time. Joachim savors the flattery with a deep breath, then claps his hands together. All right, if everyone here is as hungry as me, the kitchen staff is going to get some overtime today. Carla, Joker, and David laugh. Ed rolls his eyes. Let's get down there, Joachim says. They enter the building through the main entrance that workers are constantly running in and out of. The main room has a giant dome with 4 large glass panels on the roof. There is a large security station in the center of the room. Workers run in and out of the doorway to the left elevators. There are two enormous elevators beyond the station. The group walks to the right wing and into the dining hall. David walks hurriedly into the kitchen to rally the cooks. The rest make themselves at home as staff begin to set the table. Dave returns and assures them that dinner is underway. Joachim walks to the bar and prepares drinks for his guests as Dave lights a fire in the hearth. Ed relaxes with his scotch on the rocks. Carla inquires what they are going to do with the prototype. We were planning on shaping it into something that would help us market it to the governments around the world. We were able to create it, but didn't have a way to shape it. We sent it to Ed in America to run his tests and create a program that could manipulate what was it again? The density index against the curve of volume, Ed says. Right on, Joachim continues. Unfortunately, it was stolen during shipping, but Ed managed to recover it and complete his work on time. That is why he's earned a vacation. Hear, hear, Ed says, lifting his glass and drinking. What are you going to shape it into? Carla asks. Dave and Joachim look at each other. Dave speaks. We haven't fully decided. Joachim gives him the nod to continue. He wants to forge a sword, but I say a sculpture of some sort, a piece of art. What do you think? Joachim asks his three guests. I can't explain it. Something in the mind of that joker starts computing faster than I can keep track of. He is using his knowledge of the history yet to pass to create a cause and effect chain in his mind. He leans forward and looks Joachim right in the eyes. I think a sword is a work of art, he says. Yeah, Ed adds. Joachim leans back in his chair, smiling. Dave nods his head in defeat and manages to smile. I think it's a wonderful idea, Carla chimes in, getting carried away on explaining how a sword would make a great marketing item. Dave cuts her off and asks Joachim to decide on the dimensions of the weapon so they can work on the cooling process. It seems that the sword would be too hot after forging to place on any surface, so the exact shape has to be predicted to find the note needed to suspend the finished product in the air to cool. This is to be done by audio enhancers beyond the walls of the forging room. That joker sits back and soaks it all in. Over dinner, Dave figures out that a simple A note will sustain the metal as it cools. They eat in silence until Joachim inquires as to any ideas they might have to get inside the crystallite. Ed begins complaining that he is on vacation. Joachim informs him that he is the technology expert among them and his help is needed. After all, there might be a more efficient way to smelt the tritium within the organic computer. Ed grumbles about having to rewrite the shaping program if that's the case. Joachim offers to pay him triple his regular salary. Ed will see what he can do. After dinner, Joachim and Carla go for a walk to the farmlands to the south. Dave stays with Ed and that joker to run tests on the crystallite. Any metal they place on it is dissolved into it. Copper wires fade in and then return to original shape when pulled out. Iron filings swirl around the surface but are not dissolved in. X-rays, gamma rays, and ultraviolet light could not penetrate it. Electricity turns its color from an off-tan to a deep blue, then fades as soon as it appears. In a last-ditch effort, Ed rigs a connection to Biosyn's computer terminal using copper wires. The computer functions normally, but is unable to access the information in the crystallite. When Carla and Joachim return, Ed and Dave join them as they descend to the lowest of 14 giant subterranean levels of the building. That Joker stays with the crystalite and bides his time. He stares at the fire, concentrating on the ripples of heat, causing me to try to predict the flames. I tried to scan his mind to find the plan that he has created, but he keeps shifting the location of those thoughts and distracting me enough to keep them hidden from me. He continues this game for quite some time. I'm not sure how long I have chased him inside of himself, but I do know that it was long enough to frustrate him into turning his attention to the computer terminal. He looks through some of the files and keeps one hand on the crystal at all times. He is scanning through the shipping records when it starts. To create the elemental prototype tritium, Joachim and Dave had melted down iron and lead to create a steel. They then deconstructed the steel on the molecular level and fused it with an experimental element called iridium. They then bombarded the product with microwaves and forced it into the rectangular shape it is in. With Edmund's new program, the microwaves will be used to cast it into a much more specific shape. The metal will be broken down to the molecular level again and then forged into the one-piece sword that Joachim has designed. This whole process takes a huge amount of energy. All the resident workers were asked to shut down outlets so all power could be diverted to the shaping process. When energy is used, some is lost. The crystalite acts as a sponge for the escaping energy and soon begins to swirl its interior around. The tan color turns to a red glow. Its scanning distance became further and further with every second. It is returning to life. Down in the control room, Dave notices that the newly installed generators are spinning way too fast. When he informs the president that the fans were going to create a whirlwind outside, Joachim decides to abort the attempt. Dave shuts down the power, but the crystal is not done. Its intake of energy overrides the control room's command. Outside, the giant blades spin with an increasing velocity, turning the turbines that are drained by the crystal. The smoke from the various chimneys traces the path of the torrent air. The support beams of some of the fans begin to rock and bend. The whole building is shaking as if in an earthquake. That Joker has activated the crystal. He holds it in his hand and looks into the swirling colors. Crystallic technology is one that is interactive. It reads what one wants right from one's mind through a simple touch of the hand. A burst pattern is what he desires, and the crystal begins the energy build. He stands away and waits for it. The crystal is still draining the power reserves of the building. The fans are causing a tornado to form. I cannot let this piece of me be used to destroy. I reach out to the crystal the same way I reach out to Joker, but I am met with no resistance as I access this one of my creations. The crystal recognizes me, but still has to complete its programming. It drains the remaining energy it needs from me and releases the burst bolt. Within moments, the fans slow down. The lights in the room dim. A quiet returns. I am keeping the crystal sustained at minimum power. That Joker is gone. I use the crystal's ability to scan for any casualties or injuries. There are none. I can feel an energy surge from 14 levels down. Upon scanning, I find the forging process in the last stage. The sword is suspended in the center of the forging room. Joachim is pouring champagne to celebrate the triumph in the face of defeat. They have managed to complete the process despite the malfunctioning fans. It was Dave who cut in auxiliary power from the waterfall to save the project. It took a little longer, but the job got done. Yes, David will do nicely. Dave routes cool air through the ventilation system and then turns to join in the toast. There is a flash of light in the dining hall, and Joker is standing in the room again. I jump from the crystal to his mind to see where he has gone and what he has done. He has put on some weight and has improved his physical body's shape to some extent. He is stronger, both mentally and physically. I scan his memory and learn he had burst into 17 months ago, using a burst variation to move him through space as well as time to get back to New York City. There, he began contacting random companies and selling them information that he stole from Biosen's computer. He sold the smelting process to the American Jenna Corporation and even sold the formula for iridium to 5 separate countries. Industrial espionage at its worst. He feels a pang of guilt that he chases away before I can expand on it. After he had established himself financially, he set out to further his new human body and mind, subjecting himself to rigorous training exercises and long periods of reading and learning. He waited until his memory provided him with a specific day from the shipping records of Biosen. He waited until the plane was on the ground. Then he donned the suit of the airline worker he had clubbed into unconsciousness and stole the prototype right out from under everyone's noses. He had the metal, but no one to sell it to. So he sat in his apartment watching TV and passing the days. He sealed the metal in the ceiling of the bedroom he didn't use and waited. He knew that this second burst and reverse he had managed wouldn't last for long. Layering patterns his molecules can perform in is a temporary condition. His atoms began to break down their holding pattern, and one night the revolution of every electron shifted, and he burst forward back to Biosen's headquarters on the same night he left. 14 months' time lived through in mere minutes. While I scan him, I come across something else. He let his guard down for a moment, and I see the next step in his plan. He has distracted me from the crystal, and he has programmed a burst pattern without a reconvergence index. He descends in the elevator to the room in which his acquaintances are celebrating. As he walks in the room, I realize what he is about to do. He holds the crystal out, and I drive myself into it. I cannot override his programming, but I can alter it slightly. Being attached to it, the crystal again drains the energy it needs for this task from me. I manage to dislocate 2 of the burst beams and relocate the energy into a tagging process that I activate moments before he commences his attack. I tag the molecules in Dave's and Ed's bodies with charges that are only slightly similar. To do this, I have to interface with their bodies by flashing a radioactive light wave and being sure that all the vital parts are tagged. I am performing this task as that Joker unleashes his next wave of mayhem. He has the crystal execute his program. Both Dave and Ed are hit by burst bolts. They disintegrate immediately, and I, being slightly inside, am sent along for the ride. The change is instantaneous for me. A flash of unbearably bright light blinds them for what seems like a moment. They have no idea that their molecules have just split apart in all directions and regrouped over a period of time much longer than a single moment. The first thing they notice is the absence of the other three people, then the absence of the room that they were standing in. All the machinery, the metal walls, the chairs, the terminal they were just working at are gone. They are standing in a tunnel, constructed like a mine. The light from the nearby lanterns illuminates enough of the walls so that the two confused men can see the support beams. They look around. There is darkness and an eerie silence. "What the hell just happened?" Ed says, looking at Dave. "We seem to have been transported somehow, perhaps by teleportation, to a mining cavern underground," Dave replies. "This ain't no mining tunnel. There would be tracks for the mine cars. These walls don't look like they've been carved by digging tools." Ed walks to one of the brown walls and touches it. A layer of dirt stays on his hand and a silver handprint remains on the walls. "See? These walls are man-made, maybe constructed above ground." David starts rubbing other walls. "Hey," Dave calls, "you gotta see this." Ed walks to Dave and looks at the cleared part of the wall. Staring back at them is the earth in the pupil of an eye, the Biosyn insignia. "Freeze!" a voice behind them yells. Startled, they both spin on their heels to see 5 armed men in deep silver armor that has the texture of metal but the appearance of cloth. The lead man holsters his weapon and approaches the 2 gentlemen, insisting that they keep their hands in visible positions. Dave looks at Edmund, who shrugs. They are handcuffed and blindfolded. The captors begin leading them through the tunnel. After a few moments, Dave gives in to the disorientation and allows himself to trust the man that holds the chain to his cuffs. He takes small steps. He soon closes his eyes behind the blindfold. Edmund, on the other hand, doesn't take well to it. He struggles and stumbles and falls twice. It is a wonder the man leading him didn't just leave him to rot in the tunnel. Ed soon got the hang of it, though, and they moved on. They reach a point and are stopped. They stand and notice the bottom-heavy feeling in their stomachs that accompanies ascension in an elevator. They stand still and silent for what feels like hours to them. The men surround them, but make no sounds. Ed smiles. Dave sighs. The elevator stops and the doors open. They are led into a room and told to stop after 10 paces. The men leading them attach the handcuffs to chains extending from the floor. Dave stands stone still as Ed tests the chains. The blindfolds are taken off them and both squint until their irises can adjust. The leader of the armed men steps in front of them and addresses a chair facing a large computer terminal. "Sir, unidentified prisoners found in the old passage. I believe they may be spies," he says. "Very good, Renoir. You've done well. You and your men are dismissed," the voice beyond the chair calls back. Renoir bows slightly and turns. His men follow as he marches out. The prisoners stand waiting. "Who has sent you here?" the voice calls to them. Neither of them answer. "Where were you sent from?" Still no answer. "Where did you come from?" "I am sorry to say," Dave says, "that we can't rightfully answer that, as we don't know where we are." The man in the chair leans back at the sound of David's words. "You see," Ed adds, "we were working on a project one moment, and In the next moment, we found ourselves in your tunnel back there. The chair spins around and the figure rises, walking towards them in the shadows. You finally come back. What took you so long? He walks out into the light, and Edmund and Dave see the face of Joachim grinning at them. Gentlemen, he says, unlocking the handcuffs. Welcome back. Thanks, Dave says, rubbing his wrists. But where did we go? Not where, but when. Joachim walks to the terminal and motions for the two to follow. They walk cautiously at first. They stay, one on either side of his chair as he sits down and starts going through files in the computer. What happened to you was recorded by the security camera in the room. Joachim accessed a file from the bottom of a long list. Once inside, the monitor becomes a television screen that plays the digital recording from that night. Dave and Ed watch as they vanish from the screen, following the bright flash from the crystal. What was that? Ed asks. Dave ignores him and leans towards the screen. What's he doing? He's knocking me out with the crystal and stealing the sword. He tied Carla and I to chairs and locked us in the room. Joachim lowers his lids halfway. Where is here? Ed booms. Joachim looks from Ed to the monitor. Here is 154 years after there. He points to the screen. Ed takes a deep breath, steps back and scratches the back of his head. Dave looks at the screen and then to Joachim. You haven't aged a bit, Dave says. Oh, yes, I have. But if you're talking about my appearance, I'm much, much older than I look. Besides, I now have the latest in biotechnology pumping blood in my chest. Biotechnology? Ed rejoins the conversation. Like that crystal? No, Joachim says to Ed. That was organic technology, and there's only the one of them. He turns the chair around and addresses them both. A lot has changed. That damn Joker sold information and technology to various governments. He sold the process for tritium, and now every country has unsinkable ships, indestructible tanks, and planes with impenetrable armor. He sold your, he looks at Ed, microwave shaping method, and it was developed into a weapon used to disintegrate the invincible armed forces. And your, he looks at Dave, audio enhancers were sold and developed into Earth disruptors that ravaged cities all around the world. In fact, it was a blast from one of them that buried this place under 420 cubic feet of dirt. He leans back in the chair. That Joker had brought about all these new technologies, and he relied on the crystal to give him variations on those technologies that he could sell, so he wouldn't have to try to reproduce the crystal. I struggled along with what I could, but we couldn't keep up, and became the secondary technology manufacturer. I was able to gain access to the crystal by means of piggybacking on the energy influx. I stole about 1/3 of a program called Burst, and was able to replicate the program for modern technology. It is a form of teleportation that can move people great distances in very little time. He was pissed that I managed to steal that much, so Joker had one of the trigger-happy, glory-seeking rulers he holds in his back pocket blast us with a mountain. He turns back around in the chair. A shard of glass from the skylight in the main room pierced my chest and cleaved my heart. Luckily, my spinal column wasn't hurt. He taps his chest. 3 titanium ribs and a biomechanical heart reside in me because of it. Ed leans forward and looks at the monitor. That burst program. He looks back to Joachim. Are you able to run it now? Yes. although it does require a large amount of energy to execute. I have yet been able to understand how to manipulate the time index, Joachim says. Ed throws his hands up in defeat and begins pacing the floor. You mean you can only teleport through space? Dave asks. Correct. With the satellite network, I can burst people around the world. I just can't go through more than 100 cubic feet of Earth, which is odd, because it works through materials more dense than dirt, Joachim replies. What do we do now? Ed asks. It stands to reason, Joachim says, that if we could return you to the time that both of you vanished, you could stop that Joker and prevent the chain of events that led to this reality. Joachim ponders that possibility. Do you have a teleportation device here? Dave asks. Joachim returns from his thoughts. Yes, the last 25 feet of the 420 feet we're buried under is a false top to this mountain. From there, I move people about when it's needed. As I said, it needs a lot of energy. Can you teleport objects as well? Ed cuts in. Yes, and that takes much less energy, Joachim answers. Then why don't you get the crystal here so we can figure out how to manipulate the time index? Ed asks. No can do. He keeps it on him at all times, Joachim says. Who? Ed asks. That Joker, Joachim answers. Who? David asks. Joachim looks into his friend's eyes. Jason. He's still alive too? Ed didn't have a shred of belief in his question. He has merged with the crystal. He keeps the crystal activated and uses it as the CPU for his new body. Joachim starts going through files. It's a true terror that he's become. He brings up the file. Here, see for yourselves. The two lean in as the monitor shows them a digital visual record of Joker's body, if it can even be called that. A hulking mass of awkwardly placed microprocessors and neural decoders. It moves in slow, lumbering steps, its legs dipping under the weight of the large torso. Arm appendages swing with a calculated grace. He's a mechanical wonder, but no longer human, Joachim says. I agree with you, Dave says, still looking at the screen. His fortress is on the eastern coast of North America. If you know where he is, why don't we get over there and steal the crystal? Ed asks. Because the crystal is in the center of that. Joachim pauses the movement on the screen. The silence hangs in the room. What other choice do we have? Dave asks, looking up at Ed and Joachim. Joachim looks at Ed, whose facial expression gives away his agreement with Dave. Joachim sighs and looks at the screen. I was afraid you'd say that. He leans towards the screen. Okay, right here on the back of his torso are the storage generators. If we can disconnect or otherwise incapacitate them, he'd be forced to run on direct generation, which could help us even up the odds a bit. How do we get the crystal out of him? Ed asks. I haven't the foggiest idea. Joachim gets up from the chair and crosses the room. But when we do, I'll be able to control it with this. He picks up a device that resembles a clamp. What is this? Dave asks, walking closer. It's an input-output loop that will penetrate the crystal shell using positrons and then monitor the plasma readings within. This should give us control, even if he has fused with it. For how long? Ed asks. That's the catch. I have no way of knowing until I try. The silence returns. Edmund contemplates the chance of victory. Joachim fiddles with his I/O loop. David speaks. What are we waiting for? The other two men nod. They walk solemnly to the elevator and rise the 400 feet to the mountain's top. As they ascend, Ed and Dave take notice to the loud thumps resounding outside that grow louder as they near the top. "What is that sound?" Ed asks. "That's the warring political factions to the north and west. They've been trading cannon fire for months now." He is silent for a moment, looking forward at the elevator doors. "These are bad times, my friend. Tensions rise all around. Political treaties are worth nothing. The world is ready to go to war again, but this time, I'm not sure that she'll survive." They are quiet for the rest of the way up, with the exception of Ed's yawning and Dave's swallowing, both done to unpop their ears. The lift slows and then stops, opening its doors to the top floor. The room is about 50 feet across. On the far wall opposite the elevator, there are 10 power generator converters that stand the full 20 feet to touch the ceiling. The hum of the giant containers is filling the room and would have made it impossible to hear anyone speak, had anyone chosen to speak. In the center of the room is the control terminal that Joachim types commands into. Ed and Dave walk into the metal burst chamber in front of the terminal. Joachim scans and records their molecular patterns. Then he sets the timer and strolls into the chamber, locking the door behind them. They wait quietly. "Hey guys," Joachim says. "Yeah," they answer in unison. "Have a good trip." The room is filled with the blinding brilliance of the burst light, and their molecules are floating in the chamber. Using a wave of light, the machine projects the atoms into space and bounces them off a satellite that is orbiting the Earth in a lazy fashion. The molecules begin to reconverge into the three individuals as they descend back to the ground. The eastern seaboard rushes up at them. "We made it," Joachim says. Ed scratches the back of his head. Dave holds the front of his, fighting off the woozy feeling. They are in a darkened hallway. Light from a window at the end of the hall falls into a grid pattern on the floor. Joachim begins walking forward, slowly and quietly, turning to wave the others forward. They reach the window and look out into the ravaged landscape. No trees or grasses, no vegetation of any kind can be seen. There is a courtyard paved with blacktop and bathed in the cascading lights from the building they are in. A thick wall surrounds the grounds, and two towers stand on either side of the heavy iron doors. Beyond the wall is an endless sea of connected, closed housing. "It's so rigid and calculated," Dave says. "Technology and perfectionism combined." "It's amazing," Joachim says. Just then, the dark walls of the hall come alive with thousands of little lights that show the movement of the vast amounts of electric currents that power the building. Edmund looks around at the walls and suddenly realizes, "This isn't a building," he says nervously. Joachim and David turn to look at him. Dave turns to Joachim. "If this is his residence, then he probably has access to every room." "If he uses motion sensors," Joachim says, "then he already knows we're here," Ed finishes. From down the hall, they hear the heavy mechanical footsteps of Joker moving closer. The menacing clang of its stride sends a chill down Dave's spine. His eyes are locked on the end of the hallway, waiting for the warped monstrosity to turn the corner and deliver them to their doom. Their demise is postponed as Joachim opens one of the doors along the hall and pulls the other two in. They race down another hallway and into a large square room with furniture placed in comfortable settings. This must be where his human associates hold their meetings, Joachim says. The footsteps echo down the two halls. There is the sound of hydraulics pushing and pulling as that joker turns the corner to the first hall. The footsteps continue. Joachim looks around the room. "Find some place to hide, quick!" "Where?" Ed asks. "I don't know," Joachim answers as he hides behind a chair. Dave jumps behind the bar and ducks down. Ed surveys the room. The steps are getting louder. He hears the hydraulics strain again as it turns into the second hall. Ed dives under the large couch to his right and holds his breath. He knows that hiding wouldn't do any good. Joker is all around them. It knows exactly where each of them are. Ed peeks out from under the couch just as the mechanical monster enters the room. It stands about 8 feet high and is 3 feet across at its midsection. Near the top are 2 camera lenses that act as eyes. Below them is a small monitor with a thin green line in the center laying horizontal. The body is all gray except for the black strips of metal on the arm appendages. Near the legs, on either side of it, a mesh of wires and tubing hangs loosely and sways with its movement. In its right hand, it holds the sword that the three had forged 154 years ago. "I know you're in here," the simulated voice says, the green line jumping with every syllable. "You can't hide, and you will not escape." Its movements, Ed thinks, become slower, as if it is trying to be more ominous than it already is. It takes large steps towards the couch. come out, wherever you are," it cackles. It stops in front of the couch, and Ed can see the precise design of the feet. 3 mechanical fingers curl under and grip the couch, lifting it off the floor. Ed looks up at the machine as it holds the sofa up to get a clear swing at him. "There you are," the computer voice said. Then, suddenly distracted by the information the rest of the building is giving it at that moment, it tries to turn around and says, Wait. It is too late. David has jumped onto its back after bounding across the room and is punching the reserve generators with all his might. The machine begins to swing its torso from side to side, and Dave is tossed about but hangs on and continues punching, severing 2 of the tanks from their connections and breaking open a third. Ed jumps up as the machine drops the couch. He tries to lunge at its midsection but is knocked back by an arm appendage. Joachim is behind the chair trying to start up the I/O loop. A mechanical arm reaches over and grabs Dave by the neck, lifting him off its back and choking him at the same time. Ed jumps forward again and grabs the arm with the sword. The hydraulics pump and lift Ed off his feet. Dave struggles to loosen the grip of the mechanical hand that he dangles from. He thrashes with his legs and breaks one of the camera lenses. The machine curses and lowers the arm that Ed is holding onto. Joachim runs toward them with the functioning I/O loop and places it near a joint on the right arm. There is a spark as the positrons bombard the metal. There is a hiss as the metal melts, and a snap as the arm breaks off, leaving exposed wires to hang and glow. The machine lets out what could be considered a cry of pain and releases Dave from its fatal grip. He falls to the floor and gasps in air. Ed frees the sword from the severed hand and pounds on the enemy. The machine falls backwards and flails with its one good arm. It hits Joachim in the side and knocks him across the room. Ed continues mercilessly to slice and chop away at the metal beast's chest until he sees the swirling colors that are glowing inside the crystal. He bends down to pick it up. The cold, metallic hand of the machine wraps its constricting fingers around Ed's throat and begins to squeeze. Ed tries to lift the sword but is caught at the end of an exhale and struggles to fill his lungs. Dave dives on top of the machine and thrusts his hands into the hacked-away components. He grips the stone with the ferocity of revenge and rips it out of its holding sockets. The machine lets out an otherworldly scream as all of its systems begin to shut down. Its grip on Ed's throat doesn't loosen. Joachim grabs the sword and breathes deeply. He flexes all his muscles and holds it. When he finds his limitations, he swings with exactitude. The metal hand drops to the floor. Ed regains his breath. The blade never touched his throat. Dave holds a piece of me in his hand, an activated piece of me that I can control when I concentrate. I have yet to take action to amend my mistake, and this seems like the perfect opportunity to start. For the good of the world, I do this, and I feel no remorse for my action. I shoot across time and space into that crystal. Once inside, I find the connection points to Dave's hand and download as much knowledge into that human body as I possibly can. If I'm going to win this game of time, I'm going to need a champion for my cause, and David will do nicely. From their perspective, the crystal starts glowing a deep blue. Then it vibrates in his hand. His first reaction is to let go of it, but I have already begun the transfer, and his hand is locked in grip. A ripple starts from the inside of the crystal and expands out in all directions. It grows until the corona of light covers the entire building. Then it snaps back to its center in Dave. I must have put too much at once, because Dave drops to the floor like a rock. Joachim picks up the crystal and places it in the loop. Ed looks over his shoulder into the crystal to see all the categorized files. Ed points out the burst program and Joachim accesses it. The crystal draws power from the entire residence and the lights flicker. Joachim makes a few modifications to the running, and instead of a bolt, he causes a beam of energy to emerge from the crystal that becomes a burst doorway. Coordinates are set. Get going, Joachim says to Ed, who slings Dave over his shoulder. Here, he hands the sword to Ed. You've earned it. Ed smiles and nods. Any messages for yourself? Tell me I died. Maybe I'll live life a little fuller.